It's my great pleasure to introduce the fifth of the talks in relation to Another World's Possible, the exhibition currently at the Worm here in Aberdeen by Aberdeen People's Press, who operated between 1973 and 1984, publishing a fortnightly alternative local newspaper, pamphlets and books, as well as providing a printing service for a wide range of radical groups, community newspapers, trade unions, and campaigning organizations. In addition to its printing and publishing activities, Aberdeen People's Press also acted as a hub, a meeting place for many of the city's activist groups, a node in a wide network of people and communities across the city, Scotland, and the UK. Today's talk goes under the title, Is Another Aberdeen Possible? And it's very topical for the situation that we're currently living in. The archivist at the University of Aberdeen, Andrew MacGregor, will be in conversation with some members of Aberdeen People's Press, as well as activists current activists from the Aberdeen Social Centre. I would just like to remind you that this conversation is being recorded. Over to you, Andrew.
Welcome all. Sorry for taking you away from the Ryder Cup as I was just watching. Maybe. Welcome to the last talk of this fantastic exhibition. I just went in this afternoon to have another look and grab a poster. So thanks for the members of Aberdeen People's Press coming along today. So Alan and Ian, I think we're expecting Margaret as well maybe. And Doug and Fiona from Aberdeen Social Centre. Doug's actually in Faslane Peace Camp. So there you go, activism in action. But he went of his own accord. We didn't send him. He's not like, no expenses. So I hope you were able to attend the exhibition, also see the previous talks and perhaps create a poster for your campaign group. So I've been involved in this exhibition since the beginning, and it's been fantastic to go back in time, dust off the memories, dust off the archives in some cases, and present the story of APP to the citizens of Aberdeen. Yet this exhibition and the work that's gone around it was never just about memorializing the past. It was about reaching back into time in a critical manner and repurposing the APP story for a new generation. So it's about opening up a conversation about where we have come from, where we are now, and where we are going. So this panel tonight, as Nuno has said, will look at the past, present, and future of activism in Aberdeen. And the question for us, and I hope for you listening and watching today, is Another Aberdeen possible? A brief word from your sponsors, because you might think, who are Aberdeen Social Centre and why are they here? Aberdeen Social Centre is a space for progressive individuals and groups working to build a better future in the northeast of Scotland. The focus is on grassroots political and community organising and building connections with and capacity within the activist community. And the vast majority of the activist groups in Aberdeen are members, and the centre is based in the Aberdeen Trade Union halls in the Adelphi. So that's a word from our sponsors, if you will. So this panel, we're gonna speak for about half an hour, and then we're gonna open it up to have a chat. So we're gonna do, it's gonna be like a kind of low budget question time, if you will, and I'm Fiona Bruce, I think maybe. But so the first question, kind of in putting things in context, I'm going to ask everybody this question. And the first question is, what are the economic, political, and social structures that exist in Aberdeen that merit the existence of campaigning groups? Or, as I put it more pithy, what are you protesting about? So I'm going to go first of all to Margaret's not come in yet, so I'm going to go Ian. Can I go to Ian Baird first?
Oh dear, I put him on the spot there. But as it happens, I've just come from a event in St. Vitic's Park where we had, and am I coming through? Well, yeah, where we had a People's Assembly. Now, it wasn't organised by the Friends of St. Vitic's Park group, which I'm part of, but a lot of us attended. The People's Assembly is a concept that I personally had read about and had some awareness of, but hadn't participated in before. A lot of the people who organized it were actually members of Extinction Rebellion. And I found it quite interesting because Extinction Rebellion are in the headlines this week for being undemocratic, causing disruption, not taking consideration of views of other people. And yet this event was designed to be, it's the very opposite of that, highly structured in a sense of expected behaviors and ways of intervening and agreeing or disagreeing, but designed very much with the community at its heart. And what we're looking at is how the community might want to take control of St. Witteg's Park in the future. I mean, underpinning it is the opposition to the energy transition zone, but beyond that, because that particular issue has energized the locals, we are going forward with plans regardless of whether the ETZ is approved or not. So in other words, it's gone beyond simply objecting to that. So I found it very empowering. It was quite interesting contrasting it in my mind with the kind of things that we did back in the 70s and 80s. And really it's quite different, quite different. So forgotten the exact framing of the question, but that's an example that maybe people can comment on or build on or reflect on as we listen to the other panelists.
Okay, no, that's fantastic. And the structures in Aberdeen, I presume you're up against would be business lobbies and business leaders.
And yeah, in this case, I mean, the City Council, the industry lobbies, in this case, mainly driven by Ian Wood, still after 50 years, and the Harbour Board, which is supposed to be responsible to its stakeholders, one of which is quite specifically named in legislation as being the local community, but they have joined forces with the council and the business community, and not only seek to do something that the community doesn't want, but doesn't even talk to it or inform it of what it's doing. So those three forces collectively against the local community are extremely strong and powerful. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Alan, I'm going to move to you. I know this is deeply unfair because you left Aberdeen many years ago, but as Ian has said, some things haven't changed. So same question to you, Alan, if that's okay.
Yes, you're quite right. I do feel completely illegitimate faced with such a question. On the other hand, in the little exchanges that we had before the meeting, several things came up, like the oil and gas industry as a potential issue, as a business lobby, wealth disparities, to which could be added these days, or perhaps replace environment with climate change, with on the same playing field, more or less. And then I would assume that there would also be questions related to digital technologies, which we'll come back to, no doubt, later. But as you say, I have the feeling that a lot of these issues are strangely familiar, that they're the same actors, the famous Ian Wood, needless to say, and certainly others are finding it. The same banks, the same media groups, the same financial interests, the same what the Aberdonians like to call advocates, and kind of the business community in general. They're all still there, and they're all still beavering away in much the same business. Talking about the Harbour Board, it just reminded me of when the chain link fences went up. I don't know whether they've added razor wire on the top yet, but I remember when it was in the 1970s, early 70s, mid 70s, when the harbour was just closed off with security guards and chain link fences. the issues are still there.
Okay, thanks, Al. I'm going to move to, we're missing Margaret Lockery, but we're going to move to Doug, our reporter in the field.
Aberdeen specific. Well, I'm not from Aberdeen. I moved to the city about 20 years ago now. But even then, coming to the city from the West Coast, my image, or the image I had in my head of Aberdeen, is this, incredibly wealthy city with all this oil money flowing everywhere, and how, the streets must be paved with silver or whatever it is. And the brutal reality of it is that that's just simply not the case, or it's certainly not the case for everybody, that's for sure. The thing that struck me most about Aberdeen was just the sheer disparity, almost more so than Glasgow. There was a section across the northeast, probably taking in big parts of D-side and Donside and all the rest of it, who are very, very wealthy, and they're doing very, very well off the oil and off economic prosperity in general. But then there's a big gap, and then a huge number of people at the other end in service sector jobs, poorly paid, and they still face challenges that the previous contributors were saying they would recognise from the 1970s. And I mean, it's interesting that the very first contributor mentioned Ian Wood. I mean, this gentleman is still a massive influence on the politics and the way the economy is organised in the northeast. And I mean, looking back through the archive, as I was lucky enough to do, sort of preparing for this, I mean, the things that were being talked about, it's exactly the same stuff almost. I mean, there was only a couple that, the one that struck me that wasn't an issue anymore, perhaps, was women not being served in places like the Central Bar in Woodside, and famously on the Grill on Union Street. But other than that, it just seems that it's the same thing, things coming up again and again. So what makes Aberdeen a focus for, or why does it merit protest groups? I mean, the oil industry, we're standing on the brink of environmental catastrophe, and this is still, or Aberdeen still likes to call itself, the oil capital of Europe. If that isn't the belly of the beast when it comes to climate change, I don't know what is. And we need to take that head on if we're going to save ourselves from the looming catastrophe. Beyond that, I mean, another one, I think the northeast, D-side perhaps particularly, but the whole of Grampian area, land ownership as well. We've got so much land concentrated in the ownership of very, very, very small, a small subset of people. And I mean, that's true across Scotland, but I think you can almost see it's almost more stark in the northeast, probably linked to that wealth disparity coming out of the oil as well. I could go on, but I'll stop now.
Thanks, Doug. Belly the beast. I'll leave. Oh, it's a good one. Fiona.
Yeah, thanks. I would probably, I mean, there's lots of individual things that you could pick up on, and some have been mentioned already. I would take it a bit wider and sort of say that, I mean, really what's, so the inequalities that we see, the social centre, not so long ago, we produced some graphics about some horrific statistics of the discrepancies within Aberdeen of life expectancy, basic income, mean income. I mean, it's just scandalous, even without getting onto the food banks. But these are all products of a capitalist economy, basically, that is, it controls everything and steers everything that we do, so including environmental destruction. So I would say that's one thing. The other thing, I think, and this is the same, it's not just Aberdeen, it's just that Aberdeen is kind of on steroids because of the oil and gas, but really these are common across anywhere. It's the democracy, or the lack of local democracy, perhaps. And I think a lot of that is driven by party politics in local government. I mean, I just think it's such a toxic, I mean, party politics at any level of government is toxic, but at a local level, it's even more so. And it gives it leads to a complete lack of empowerment for the local communities, like Ian was just talking about. You know, the Citizens' Assembly that was happening today here in Torry. You know, it's we need so much more of that. And I'd just like to see a complete restructure of how we do local government. I think that would help enormously.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Alan, you have to speak.
I would perhaps just add one particularly flagrant and or pertinent question of an issue shared between the 1970s today, and that's the media, the control of the media. And we wouldn't have used the language at the time, but basically APP was a media project. I mean, the whole point of Aberdeen People's Press was the democratization of the media and grassroots control of the narrative that was being put forward, trying to get issues and ideas across to onto the political agenda, something which was very largely impossible then, and I assume is probably impossible today, with the mainstream commercial media. Certainly in France, it remains the same problem 30, 40 years on. And in Aberdeen, it must be the same. Concentration, industrial concentration, financial concentration, concentration of power among large multinational companies for the most part, in very close proximity with political decision makers, and with the obvious kind of diffusion of influence going in both directions. That has only accentuated since over the last half century.
Thank you. I think that's quite a lot of plagues and a lot of houses we've covered, so we'll maybe move on to. So we're going to look at past, present, and future. It's going to sound like a Back to the Future film just now, but so we're going to look at past first. I'm afraid Margaret's not come in, so I'm going to pass to Doug on the past question. So the question is basically, do you think Aberdeen has a radical past? Is it a radical past to be proud of? Is it important to have that tradition? What do you think, Doug?
Yes, and yes. I'm presuming you want more than that, though. Yes, I mean, whether you go back to the public meetings that used to be held on Broad Hill, through to the events with fascists being chased off the streets in the Castlegate, even before that, I mean, there's not many places in Scotland where Kropotkin spoke, or even famously, even John McLean passing through here. Yes, I think Aberdeen undoubtedly does have a radical tradition. Even I don't know the exact numbers, but there's an awful lot of people went to the Spanish Civil War, for example, from Aberdeen, and these traditions continue. And I think right through the 70s and to today. Is it important to have that tradition? Absolutely. I mean, it gives us. It's not so much that it gives us something to be inspired by, something to look back on, people to take lessons from, I suppose. All of these things are helpful and they're important, and they build something of a character about it. I mean, Glasgow, where I'm from, is very good at riffing off the whole red, and maybe even Dundee's got a bit more of that. It's more that assertive tradition there, but I think maybe Aberdeen sells itself short a little bit. Having moved here and read bits and pieces and attended events about the history, I think it definitely has, and I think it is important for today. Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Doug. That's your history lesson for the day, kids. No. In lieu of Margaret, I don't know if Ian or Alan, you want to drop anything into that. I'm just wondering, you were probably too busy just getting on with APP, but did you feel the APP was part of a kind of tradition, or is it something that maybe you started to think about as the 70s wore on?
I think, I mean, I remember when the past was the present, you know, as I say. But I'm not much of a historian in terms of Aberdeen's radical history, but I have picked up much relatively recently, in the sense of the last 20 years, realized just how many radical elements there have been in Aberdeen. And that's despite being around when Aberdeen, the General Strike and other publications were produced by Aberdeen's People's Press, looking at historical examples. But there are many more. And there's particularly people like Elizabeth Mayo and a lot of feminist people who did very early, very pioneering work. And if Charlie's listening, he recently sent me some stuff about some of these people, and I'm sure he'll chip in if he's listening to this. But on Doug's point about there being more in your face in Glasgow, as it were, and people being more proud of their working class history, I think in Aberdeen, I mean, you suggested maybe we haven't made as much of it. I mean, I'd maybe go further and say that it's been shoved under the carpet because the administrations and the people in power, nobody's really been wanting to show any pride in those radical movements, because they're people with a very different agenda. But I'm not a historian, so I'll pause at that, I think.
Okay. Margaret was not here, so we'll maybe move on to the present, if that's okay, because if we start me on history, I could be here a long time. So we're going to move on to the present, if that's okay. So the present, do you think the campaigns of today have what it takes to succeed? What do they have? What are they missing, perhaps? Why are they maybe not being as successful as they could be? Are there any current social movements that are inspirational? I know Ian spoke about St. Fittick's, but are there any others that maybe come to mind? I'm going to come to Ian on that one, first of all.
I think for me, things are a combination of being extremely depressing for the future. Well, for the present. I mean, they come to the future, but presently they're very depressing. In terms of the futility of the opposition to causes which are taken as worthy. And even where you seem to have a majority of opinion, and I think obviously the environmental crisis is the best example of that. It seems, despite an almost universal agreement of where we are on this, the people who oppose or disagree with the fundamental problem that we have should be on the fringes, and everybody else should be in step doing what's necessary, but that doesn't seem to be happening, or it's happening much more slowly, and people being dragged into positions. And as we discussed with a local example in St. Fittick's, but the forces of the powerful forces seem to persist with great influence and great power. So I find that all very, very depressing. But on the other hand, I find some things more optimistic. Although I think we all agree that the issues are the same today as they were, I think that some of the issues have changed in emphasis. And the example I would give of that are maybe sexual politics, which have obviously changed radically. And at the time in the 70s and 80s was really just the beginning of what was then called gay liberation, which is a very just cause and campaign. But I think we realize now it was probably fairly limiting in terms of what we understand now about sexuality and gender. So although there's debates on that, and there's a very very big debate on gender at the moment, which is kind of splitting the left. But nevertheless, I think sexual politics and racial politics as well, although there's much to be sad about, I think we've progressed a great deal in those respects, and we have a more inclusive society now, I think, than we did have in the 70s and 80s. So I think we have to recognise the progress that we are making on those two fronts, at least.
I'm glad you finished on a positive. That was very good, thank you. I'm going to move to Fiona on that one as well.
Yeah, well, I know what you mean, Ian, about it can seem a bit depressing at times, but whenever I feel like we're never going to achieve anything, you know, we're too small and all the rest of it, I just think of bloody Nigel Farage and what he managed to achieve with virtually, you know, well, certainly not any positive power, but that's a very negative example. So yeah, we just need to yeah, take the lessons from it. I think there's a lot of really good stuff happening in Aberdeen, everywhere, but you know, I mean in Aberdeen most definitely, and even over just the last few years, you know, initiatives and groups are springing up, but we're all in the same boat. We're all hampered, just as you were saying, Stuart, there, by the powers that are ranged against us. And again, that comes back to the system that we're operating in, and the power structures. You know, I mean, you've only got to look at the policing bill, you know, so I know that's not relevant for Scotland necessarily, but you know, it's a slippery slope. So I think the groups, all of us, I think we have to get better at not asking permission and just kind of pushing back a bit more, you know, about, and that comes, to do that, it really helps if you have a strong base and if you have a lot of support. And I think, you know, I see a role for the social centre there. You know, that's kind of what we're all about. We're about trying to find common themes and provide that support and network, you know, within the local activist community, because yeah, we all have individual things that we're sort of focused on, but the really big stuff that we need to shift, we need to work together for that. You know, whether it's whether it's racism, whether it's inequality, homelessness, you know, whatever, everything is interconnected, and it's all down to basic social injustice. So that's, yeah, I think that's the point I would make.
Okay.
Oh, can I just add, sorry, I'll tell you what they don't have, because you asked what they don't have. They don't have necessarily much of a, you know, when it comes to mainstream press, they don't have a voice necessarily, they don't have a platform necessarily, or that visibility. We do within the activist community, but we don't have that visibility unless people are blocking roads or something like that. It's the only time you get a picture in the paper. So, you know, Aberdeen People's Press, that they were there for that. You guys were there for that at the time. And I'd like to see something similar, you know, that can be giving us that visibility and that wider reach. Sorry, I'll shut up now.
Something that's missing. I'm going to ask you to get your crystal balls out next, Mystic Meg. We're going to look to the future. Robots. No. So the question in the future, what do you think will be the campaigns of the future? Will there be any alignments, realignments? I think another sub-question that is, if we're talking about Aberdeen specifically, how can activists shape Aberdeen post oil and gas? Because that is most likely to be future. So I'm going to go to Alan first of all.
Putting down Aberdeen specifically as a qualifier. And I'm just wondering how meaningful that is. I mean, it's obviously meaningful in a sense because there are local issues and there are local context and all the rest. But the weight of what is absolutely not local is just so overpowering at the moment. And particularly, my particular obsession is more with questions of, with media and communication. But the whole business, I mean, there are two kind of overwhelming issues which have to be faced in Aberdeen, but as elsewhere. And that's the whole question of the digital technologies and the question of privacy of our personal data, but also the privatization of our intimate private lives, which is well underway. The whole question of surveillance capitalism, which is not just an issue, but it's our context, and it's our context for me here in France, for you in Aberdeen, for anywhere, and it's very extremely difficult at the moment, virtually impossible to get out of that context. And the other thing is the question of digital media. I remember in the 1980s, there was a big change in printing technology, which opened up the possibility. There's a whole discourse at the time about the democratization of the national press, the daily local press. Printing became relatively less capital intensive. It became relatively easier to get into on a local level or on a national level. And there were attempts to do that, but none of them succeeded. The net result of the technological change at the time was further concentration. It was Murdoch, it was Maxwell, and all the rest of it. Nowadays, we have digital media, we have internet, and I think we have a very real problem on every level. And I think particularly on a local level, when trying to get that visibility, what's missing from current movements and struggles is visibility. And how to get that visibility when faced with the mainstream commercial press and its acquaintances, etc. And also with, we keep coming back to all the questions of, just the use of language. I mean, we're being undefined, redefined out, included out, as a famous cinema producer once put it, by the whole question of what we call things, how we name things, how we name media. Everything's lumped under social media today. And the whole question of alternative media, to get back to Aberdeen People's Space, and collective efforts at producing information and getting questions onto the political agenda is extremely difficult, because on the one hand, social media are used by the conventional mainstream media constantly to blur everything, to create confusion, to create doubt on anything. There's always somebody, often related to a newspaper, or often know it, who can get themselves heard and say whatever they like. And the media are past experts at saying things, knowing they're blatantly untrue, and knowing that even if they have to correct, apologize, give a right of reply, it's much too late, because it serves almost no purpose, a right of reply, once the information has been injected into the news cycle with a whole battery of press agents and all the rest of it. What used to be journalists, most journalists nowadays come out of journalist school and they become attaché de presse. I don't know how you say that in English. They become communicating people whose job is to put out information and inject it into the media one way or another. They're very expert at it, and they know exactly how it works. And the whole problem is once these things are out, you can't take them back. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube afterwards. And then the same media who are either use or are at least delighted to have people creating confusion left, right, and centre on social media. By social media, I mean Facebook and Twitter and such like. They're also the people who systematically ignore the existence of alternative media, alternative collective media, people who actually do a journalistic job to get information, to gather information, to check information, to get it out to the people, you might say, who need to hear it or should hear it, or we would like them to hear it. By lumping alternative media, I don't know what you have. You certainly must have dozens and dozens of alternative media in Britain at the moment, which I'm not particularly familiar with, but certainly in France, there are some extremely effective alternative media, but they're lumped always by the commentators on television, on radio, in the print media, as social media. So it's a systematic job of disqualifying alternative media by putting them into what the establishment press is delighted to have for creating confusion, but then will turn around and say, but they're just social media because all they do is create confusion and doubt, etc. I mean, they're having a cake very much and eating it at the same time. And I think the question of press, in the end, is another version of press freedom. It's a question of democratizing information sourcing. The distribution of information is absolutely vital for whatever movement that you happen to be involved in, and also vitally important in the age of GAFAM and surveillance capitalism. Call it what you will. Sorry, I could rave on about that.
No, surveillance capitalism. I had a long list of future woes, and I never had that one on my list. So thanks. I'm going to go to Doug next, please.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Alan was saying there about. I mean, I think if it's not already happened, I think we're on the cusp of some sort of. It's almost like a digital enclosure where we're moving from relative liberty online to media and social media being mediated through a lot of large commercial companies. But I'm not sure there's much more I can add to that. You asked what campaigns of the future in Aberdeen. I think it's right. As someone, I think it was Ian was maybe talking about. There has been progress in, on the grounds of, gender, sexuality. These issues have moved on in the past 50 years, and there have been positives. But I think if there's one area where there possibly hasn't been that much movement, it is maybe on sort of economics in the broadest sense. And I think that's tied in completely with the climate crisis. Sorry to bring it back to that again, but it's on my mind. I mean, the futures campaigns, or at least for the next 10 years anyway, if not longer, to the middle of the century, I don't know. It's going to be focused on trying to stop our planet becoming uninhabitable for humans, which is effectively what we're talking about. If we can overcome what faces is there, I think that in Aberdeen and around the world, we're going to have to look at how we organise our economy. And I think in Aberdeen, there are just tiny, tiny embers of different possibilities in the shape of Bonobo and Krakatoa. These are genuine worker, horizontally organised workers' cooperatives organised around anarcho-syndicalist principles, and they are working and they are popular and they are successful. Maybe they're a proof of concept, I don't know. And I would love to add that little kernel, that little seed, if you like, to spread out into the broader economy, not just in Scotland, but, well, everywhere.
Well, in my Aberdeen of the future, we don't need campaigning groups because all the problems have been solved and we're all living in complete harmony. But sadly, I think that's some way off. Yeah, I think probably for the next, like Doug was saying, I think for probably the next 10 years, well, maybe not. Well, yeah, but I think nothing is going to change that much in the next few years. So I think the campaigns that we're all engaged in just now are still going to be, are going to be there. But I think, I think COVID and Brexit, between the two of them, they've really blown wide open just how unequal our society is and where the huge gaping problems are. I think it's also really interesting that we're all finding out a lot more about how things work. So, the shortages that we're starting to see because of ridiculous practices and, the problem with CO2 production, which seems so bizarre when we're trying to get rid of CO2, but what we're using it for, and it's just, we live in such an unsustainable way. And I think we're so much more aware now than we were. And I don't just mean like us and, who are involved in campaigns at the moment. I mean, everybody, general public, who perhaps don't, wouldn't necessarily be thinking about it, but when it's thrown in your face, it's there. So I think potentially we might see more campaigning around really radically shifting how we do things. I mean, we spend, I was horrified to find out yesterday that last year the UK spent 21 billion on the police, funding the police. Why? What do we need? I think there's big questions round about there, and I think people are going to be, when you've got food banks and children living in poverty and people sleeping and dying on the streets, why are we spending? If you had an equal society, would you need, why do you need so much being spent on the police? 6 billion on the prison service. Again, I mean, that can be radically reformed. I think more people have always asked questions about this, but I think perhaps people are going to start really asking more questions. I hope they do. And we might see more campaigns sort of, starting up about that. And local democracy, I think, moving even beyond citizens' assemblies, I would like to see, I cannot remember where I read it, and I wish I could, because I would love to go back and look into it in more depth, but I read a proposal where the local council, instead of being sort of like the body that controlled everything happening in a region, it was actually simply there as a platform to facilitate and enable community decisions and actions, across the board. I would love to see that. And the fact that we're hearing so many more people now are talking about citizens' assemblies, are doing citizens' assemblies. And actually, I forgot to add that when you said in the last question, was there any groups that I wasn't particularly impressed with? I'm impressed with XR, because I know they get a lot of criticism and all the rest of it, but they're just doing it. They're not asking permission, they're just doing it. And the citizens' assembly idea, when you actually see people doing it, it really makes you start to think, yes, actually there's other ways of doing things. So yeah, I think these are kind of like the apart from the campaigns that we have at the moment, I think those are areas I would like to see more actions happening around. I don't often, I've got a rubbish memory, so I don't often quote anybody, but Angela Davis had a brilliant quote, and it was, you have to act as if it was possible to radically change the world, and you have to do it all of the time. And I think we all have to keep that in mind, and that's how we should be acting.
I can't beat that quote. I had a lovely quote to sum up, but I'm going to ruin it. So I'm going to say thank you very much to participants. No, yours was much better than mine. I'm too ashamed to say it. Thank you very much to participants. I'm going to open it up to the chat. I'm going to pass to Nuno. He's probably going to come onto screen.
Hello there. Yes, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, all the panelists. We still have a few minutes, about a quarter of an hour or a bit more, if you want to have some questions from the attendees. Okay, well, maybe I will ask a question myself, and just be the first one to anyone in the panel, really. If we are to be here, all together sitting in Aberdeen in 30 years' time. What do you think the issues we'll be talking about are in terms of activism?
Can I answer one? Because since I wasn't asking them, I think an interesting one is nationalism. Now everything is being put through that prism in the last what is it now, 7 years, and will continue to be. Of course, nationalism's been around since the late 19th century, but has sped up dramatically in the last 15 years, and it's difficult to see that not becoming a major continuing discussion for the next while. So I think that's one that's not going to go away, and it will see alignments and realignments. I think that's been happening already since the independence referendum. I think the other one we'll be discussing is, I think Ian has said it about the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. They probably achieved more in that short time. And it's a good example of issues that have always been there and see massive peaks of activity and advances many years, and then all of a sudden something happens and change occurs at institutional, organizational, governmental level in a very quick time. And I think that's very interesting. And I think there's a lot more. We've got much more to continue on that journey, especially on the Black Lives Matter movement, and decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing the museums, public spaces, whatever. So,
yeah, 30 years from now, I mean, obviously, as Fiona already said, we'll all be living in a wonderfully harmonious city with no poverty and greenery everywhere, and the oil industry will be a distant memory, and everything will be lovely. But yeah, perhaps we should move back to those questions. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Steve Gray is asking, is there a radical history of Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire? I suppose a published radical history of Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire?
Yeah.
Nice project. Nice project for someone then. Chris Howdard is asking, how much has a focus on inclusion resulted in attention to inequality?
I'm not sure. I think I need the definition of inclusion unpacked slightly there. In my mind, inclusion is a tool to impact inequalities, but maybe I'm missing something there.
I'll let Chris maybe give that question a little bit more information. There's someone who's asking, do you have anything regarding Black Lives Matter in Aberdeen? And again, that's one of the questions I think is very, very important, because throughout these conversations, I'm not sure who the attendees were, but largely the panelists were mostly white people and also of a generation. So we're in our 40s and 50s and so on. I'd be very interested, to see the connections. I mean, maybe the social centre has them already, but how can we connect these conversations to younger folk, but also to people of color within the city and shire? Andrew?
I wasn't going to answer the question you've just posed. It was just a point of information. At the time of Derek Floyd's death, the fences of Duthie Park, right along Riverside Drive, were draped with posters, messages, flowers, Black Lives Matter statements, so on. I'm not on the streets, as it were. I don't know what groups there are, but it was very visible to me as a person who's not really in the activist community in many ways, but noticed it. So it must be happening out there. Andrew, maybe you've got more information on
that. Doug probably knows. Was it Hysteria, the group?
Yeah, that particular and very innovative protest or demonstration was organised to take into account the fact that we're all living in plague times, COVID restrictions. It wasn't just Duthie Park. There were another festooned and banners and protest materials, and they organised stewards to be there just to ensure distancing was kept going. And yeah, it was Hysteria. Well, it was some of the activists from Hysteria who initiated that protest. There is at least one other group who've organised protests around Black Lives Matter in Aberdeen. I don't know much about them though.
I think there's a students group as well, which connects to a point I was going to make and goes back to the question you asked, Nuno. And one thing we didn't mention tonight is Aberdeen has a massive student base, and they must fit into this story here. And I think going back in history, present, there's always been student groups. They've always been connected with city groups, shall we call them. But there's most definitely never been maybe as much capitalization on that as there could have been, considering the 15,000 students at the University of Aberdeen, and then you add in RGU and you add in the college. So I think there's definitely something about the connections between the teenagers, we'll call them, and, as Juno said, a white 40-odd-year-old man such as myself.
Very good. Mike is making a point with the question at the end. He says a little bit long, but I'll read it. Yesterday, I attended a rally outside the Scottish Parliament, organised by school students striking for the climate, part of a worldwide movement. I think Fiona's comment about how we need to be better at not asking permission is really important. The people in power will never listen to reason and rightly injustices. The system is ruled by profit. So the need is for social movements which can challenge and stop at least aspects of injustice as part of building the new cooperative world. The resistance to the energy zone in Tory seems very hopeful. At the climate strike rally, a speaker from Fife described local organizing aiming to shut down the Mossmorran petrochemical site. Any thoughts? Has there been many strikes by school students in Aberdeen?
Hi, I think Steve answered that in the chat. Steve
Yeah.
Gray's on the call. He was quite involved with the school strikes, I think. So there were two in 2019 pre-COVID, he's saying.
Very good. Thanks, Steve. Lynn is saying, we are here, Scotland, are a group to raise the profile and create opportunities to Black, Indigenous, people of color creatives that was initiated by Ika Headlam from Aberdeen, also known by his Creative Meet podcast. That's a great point, Lynn, and we should definitely try to involve Ika. I was just thinking about him this morning, but that's a really, really good point. It seems that things are happening, and there are several ways of organizing in Aberdeen that are happening simultaneously. I mean, you guys will know much better than I do what's going on, but if there's any way to kind of approximate them, I once again offer the Worm as a space dedicated to the city, mostly a visual arts place, but a place where groups can organize. And I'll just remind you of something that Andrew said in the beginning. We have currently a Peacock poster workshop, which was modeled in the kind of May '68 poster workshops, where we are inviting current left-wing groups in the city or community organized groups as well, to come in and make a poster, a risograph letterpress poster with us. We'll help you design it. We've had about seven groups, ranging from identity politics to the environment to St. Fitix, and we're still open for that. So we want to offer this hub where different campaigns can meet each other in this historical plaza of the Castlegate. Lynn continues to say, it strikes me that a lot of radicalism in and around Aberdeen sits within silos and echo chambers. How do the panel suggest we engage wider audiences in these conversations? Great point.
Yeah, I was just going to say I couldn't agree more, and that's kind of, you know, something we're hoping the social centre can help with. Certainly with the connected efforts bit, and I think to some extent we are. Obviously, things got slightly chapped on the head with COVID, and set things back a bit. But yeah, we've got big plans for doing just that. But the trick is getting out beyond, as you say, out beyond the activist community and get it out into the wider, public. And yeah, that's where I see maybe some kind of, and actually what I was going to ask before we started asking questions, I was going to ask Alan and Ian what they thought an Aberdeen People's Press or equivalent would look like now, and what we could be, what we could be doing. Would it have the same format? What would the distribution be? Where would you take it? How could it compete with social media, as you were saying, and an online presence? But that's one way, of doing it, just having copies all over, so people are reading it that perhaps aren't involved in the activist community, and it just starts to spark ideas. I like Steve's idea as well there in the chat about share street events.
Thank you. Doug, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was more or less going to say exactly what Fiona just said. I can paraphrase if you want. Probably a bit of a waste of time. The social centre was trying to do exactly that thing, breaking down the silos and COVID. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Alan Marshall.
To reply to Fiona's question, what would a latter day Aberdeen People's Press look like? I think the simple answer to that is that it would look like the people who produce it. The question of the means of producing it is no longer a question. It's so easy to materially or dematerially to produce it using online technologies of whatever sort will exist or will come to exist. The question is what you put into it, and the question is, and that comes from us. That comes from it comes from you, the activists. It comes from the people all around your network. So it comes from to my mind, the collective effort of doing journalism, of producing information, producing stories, talking about people, talking to people, draining all that information and processing it and putting it out in a coherent, meaningful way. And it's never been so easy. It depends on the people.
Thanks very much. Ian?
Yeah, I was just going to quickly pick up because my imagination's running rife now. I mean, if we're talking about silos and the difficulty of getting messages beyond closed circles, suddenly, and Fiona's raising the point about what would APP do, suddenly the idea of printing a paper and selling it in the pub seems a very radical idea to do today. Because it would be such a different proposition to a punter than the constantly Facebook feeds or choosing from the plethora of social media sites. I'm not offering, but
thanks a lot for that, Ian. And I'll just pick up on that but there, because we are a printing house here. We're mostly a fine art printing house, but we also have other types of technology, and we're still very dedicated to the printing of things, to the printing onto things, to the printing with ink, to printing using your hands, to DIY printing, to passing on skills that are centuries old going forward. And I think that you know, this is a wonderful way of wrapping up the conversation. Also with a positive note, maybe something that we can organize going forward with Aberdeen Social Centre, with Andrew University, with APP and Peacock. Maybe we have a get together just to start exploring this question, maybe going back to a physical, you know, distributed by hand, face to face, in conversation with people, something that would connect all of these different groups. This because, you know, people are tired. People feel that a lot of the time their activism is leading to nowhere, and I think this would be a great reinforcer of what is already going on, including obviously the campaigns, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, you know, people from different communities that made Aberdeen their home, but also making something out of that incredible student presence in the city that could be mobilized. So I would like to thank everyone, the panelists and people who took time to attend this, Andrew for organizing it, and you guys for taking your time in such a beautiful beach day in Aberdeen. I'll just say that we've extended the exhibition. It's been very well received. We've extended the exhibition to the 11th of December. So we have still a bit of time. We want to engage with schools. We feel that we haven't done that properly yet. We want to continue working in a digital archive. And obviously, as just been mentioned, there's the poster workshop. Lee French, who is one of the people in the audience, he used to run for about 10 years, maybe over 10 years, a magazine called Variant, which is a radical magazine out of Glasgow that dealt very much with the conditions of artists, working conditions of artists, and the whole conversation around visual arts in Scotland. It stopped publishing it about 2010, and we are trying to find ways to bring an issue out, a physical issue, something that again can be distributed. So I hope that Lee will also take part of our future conversations. He was in a residence for a week within the exhibition working on this project. So thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend.